Greetings, Professor Laird here. I just wanted to provide a few things that might help you in finalizing your paper, which is due pretty soon. So what I want to talk about in this short video, I'm going to look at the syllabus for a couple of minutes. Then I want to go in and look at the previous video that I provided for you that talked about the paper assignment. I want to touch on a couple of things with that. Then I want to take a quick look at the sample bibliography, which has been on Moodle. And then also want to go through for a few minutes the guide to writing your paper, which provides some good tips on how to maximize the effectiveness of your paper. So I want to talk about those things in this short video. So let's go to the syllabus first. The syllabus is pretty generic as far as the paper assignment goes. All my classes have a paper assignment, and this is just the general instructions. As far as the final paper goes, 4.5 pages minimum. So between 4.5 to 5.5 pages is really all I would need on that to demonstrate your writing skills. The topics have already been finalized. If your topic has not been determined, if you have not submitted one, I won't be able to accept your paper. The online classes papers will be attached to a forum. This is for the online classes. The in-class classes, of course, will just hand me a hard copy of it. But for the online classes, I'll set up a forum, and you will attach your paper in a Word file to that forum in Moodle. I do that for a specific reason, so be sure to make note of that, because with a Word file, I will be able to put the comments on that file and email those comments back to you. The format for the papers is double-spaced, 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margins. Now, be single-spaced for the reference page. Talk about that here in a second. Speaking of references, there'll be a minimum of 6 references for your paper, 4 of which will need to be peer-reviewed academic journals. As I've talked about them many times already, the peer-reviewed academic journals are going to be the heart of your paper. That's where your analysis will come from, that you are reviewing and describing what you've learned. Another reminder here, the paper will be an objective critical analysis of the issue. This is not going to be an editorializing or an opinion forum. I want to find out what you've learned about that issue. We'll talk about the guide here in just a second. Again, we'll repeat a few of these things when we talk about that in the guide. So the bottom line is to read a lot from the credible sources that you have found and describe what you have learned. Do not copy and paste anything. We'll talk here in a few minutes as far as citing your sources briefly within the text. And then, of course, we've already talked about how to cite them on your bibliography. We'll look at that again here in a few minutes. Now let's look at a few slides that I talked about previously in a video on your paper. In that particular video, I just provided a general outline or a general structure suggested for you to follow to keep it a little bit more organized. Again, we're looking at 4.5 to 5 pages minimum. So your introduction will be 1 to 1.5 pages. Talk about what would be going in there here in a few minutes. Again, the meat of your paper is the analysis, or what might be often called the literature review, where you're finding those peer-reviewed sources and then describing what you've learned from those, 3 to 4 pages. Your summary or your conclusion would not need to be more than about 1/2 page or so. And then the references will be on a separate final page there. We'll look at that again here in a minute. As far as your introduction, you want to state clearly what your issue is, and your topic has been approved, but you want to start logically at the beginning at what you're describing. What's the issue? What will you be addressing in this paper? Why is it a problem? Why is it important? You might even want to touch on some of the social costs that you've already found as kind of a preview of what you'll be addressing. As with any introduction, you might want to back up just a bit, give me some causal factors, or perhaps even a recap or a brief history of how we got to where we are right now. The focus of your paper, of course, is what's happening now, or reasonably current, because peer-reviewed academic journals take a little while to get published. So something that happened today, you would not have a peer-reviewed journal on it, but you want to be as recent as you can. But with your introduction, you can kind of bring the reader up to date. What are some milestones or some landmarks of that topic that you can touch on that's going to logically bring the reader up to where we are now? You don't want to just plop the reader down in the middle of something and they're going, well, where are we? What are we talking about here? So you want to make sure it's clear where this issue came from fairly briefly, because you only have a page and a half to really wrap that up and get us to what's going on now. Now, your credible sources, your credible news sources can also help you describe what is going on now, or even some valuable news reports from the past that can bring the reader up to speed as far as what's going on. But again, your news sources, which need to be credible, legitimate news sources, can also help you describe what's going on, and not just in the introduction, but throughout your paper as well. You want to blend those with your peer-reviewed academic journals to make it an interesting, informative paper. That's the bottom line. You want to make it interesting and informative. You don't want to just talk about stuff and tell me what you think about stuff. You want to describe what you've learned in an interesting and informative manner. The analysis, the heart of your paper, the midsection, sometimes called the literature review, because that's where you're really describing what you've learned from these very valuable sources. What are the whys, what fors, how comes? You want to describe stuff, give me examples, explanations, be interesting. Like I said, again, your peer-reviewed academic journals are going to be at the center of this analysis, because you want to find what studies have been done. What did you learn from them? What are they measuring? How are they measuring that? What are the results that they found from their study? Are there any recommendations that they make? Are there any common causal factors that they were able to determine that might be useful to address for policymakers to take from there? There's lots of other legitimate data sources out there to help describe your topic, such as government agencies that are in the business of just compiling data and putting out reports, universities that even have groups within the university or professors providing information from their studies, bipartisan think tanks. Again, bipartisan is the key word here, because you're looking at nonprofits, nonpartisan think tanks that are just trying to get to what's really going on. Again, that may be sometimes hard to determine whether or not it's a partisan or bipartisan think tank, but you can usually find that out in the description of that particular organization. And then you want to balance that out. If you're finding some information from a think tank that might be leaning more progressive or more conservative, then you might want to balance that out with another group or whatever. But there's lots of nonprofit foundations out there that are trying to find information, research hospitals, watchdog groups, investigative organizations, things like that can help add to your sources as well. As far as your summary goes, it does not need to be very long, because for the summary, you don't want to just repeat what you just said. You want to provide some observations or some insight as to what you've learned from those very credible, legitimate sources. Are there any common conclusions that these various sources that you found that could actually tie them together? Is there a common theme as to what's causing this problem, or some general causal inferences that some of these studies had actually measured to find correlations between this or that? Or are there any particular policy recommendations that have been made that you could perhaps tie together as far as what might be a common goal in order to try to alleviate the social costs of this particular problem, this particular issue? Are there some possible directions for future research that might be worth undertaking based on what you've already learned from these sources thus far. Speaking of sources, let's take a look at the sample bibliography again. Okay, this is the sample bibliography that's been posted on Moodle. You want to use this as a go-by. You want it to be neat, tidy, organized, in the proper format. We've talked about the proper format quite a bit. I've even given you a forum to provide some sample sources in the proper format, and I've provided comments on those. Here I've got an assortment of different type of sources. The main thing, of course, is that each citation is single-spaced with a space in between, and they are in alphabetical order with the last name first. If there is no byline for that particular order, then you could, for that particular citation, you could use Associated Press as the author. But as I've said before, with the peer-reviewed journals, the format is very particular. You want the author's name, last name first. Any subsequent authors can follow that. Don't have to be last name first. Followed by a period, followed by the year that article was published, period. And then the title of that article in quotation marks, because that brings it out. Oh, that looks like an interesting article, because I can zoom in on that and see what the title of that article is. And then most importantly, this is very important, the most important part of your citation is the name of the journal, and that is in italics because it is the publication. That's the industry standard. Put it in italics, followed immediately by just the numbers, volume, issue in parentheses, colon, page numbers. That's all I need. Very simple. It tells me everything I need to know. And then all your other subsequent sources are in that same general order. As you can see with the website, author, date. You want to be more specific on the date because the internet is publishing things daily. Followed by the title of that article on that website. And then whose website is that? Basically, in this case, npr.org. Followed, the main difference here, is followed by that link, which is mercifully short on these news items. Your web link for something like this would be a mile long because you're getting into a dozen different places to get to this one little article, so that it's not necessary. All I need is this right here, very simply, for your peer-reviewed journal articles that are coming out of that digital library. As far as your website sources, I need the link, which is generally going to be short, in many cases just the title of the article, and then when that was accessed. As far as edited volume, got some examples here as well. The book is the same general order as well. Author's name, year, title of that book in italics, because that's what's being published, followed by the place and the publisher. So as you can see, I have almost a dozen sources here, all on one page. So you should need more than one page to do your sources if it's in this very organized format as shown here. So use the sample bibliography as a go-by. All right, now let's look at the guide to writing your paper. This is just a kind of a summary of the three basic criteria that I use when I'm grading your papers. And the writing assignment is 25% of your final grade, so you really want to put some effort in this using critical objective analysis of your relevant topic that has been submitted and approved. The first criteria is following instructions, and we've talked about that quite a bit. So let's just jump to the second criteria, which is the quality of your syntax. That's your sentence structure, the grammar, the way you write your sentence, organization, paragraphs. So my biggest recommendation for that would be to proofread it, proofread it, proofread it, and then proofread it again. Can't proofread it enough, because if you proofread it, that's going to catch those clumsy sentences, those run-on sentences, those incomplete sentences. You want to proofread it to make sure that it sounds good, that it's making sense. Are they complete sentences, grammatically correct, clearly stated? Use punctuation effectively. If it sounds natural when you're reading it to pause when you're phrasing a sentence. We'll put a comma there because that would help the reader do that same thing. That would help the reader absorb that information a little bit more clearly. This creates a flow in your narrative that is kind of hard to explain to somebody, but when a reader is reading it and that flow comes across naturally, it makes it easier for them to read it, aids in the clarity for the reader. You want to use logic in the organization of your narrative. Start at the beginning. This is not a Quentin Tarantino movie where you start in the middle and then jump back to the beginning, then go to the end, and then come back to the middle. You just want to be very clear as to what you're talking about in a logical order that brings the reader along as to what this issue is. First of all, how did we get here? What's happening? What are the problems? What are the studies saying? So you want to bring that reader along in a clear manner that helps their understanding, their reading of it. You want to assume the reader does not really know much about the topic. Bring them along progressively so that they understand what it is that you've learned. And what I've learned for many years there is the best way to actually learn about something is to teach it or present it to someone else. Then that means you are really learning it, because then you have to describe what you've learned in your own words, which has power. That is very useful purpose for you to learn something and then try to explain that in your own words. Very powerful. Use paragraphs. If your entire paper is just one big paragraph, that is not going to be very clear for the reader, because that way they're not going to be able to break it up into these chunks where each chunk has got its own little idea, and then you go to the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. That brings the reader along a little bit more clearly. Don't try to write in flowery prose. You just want to get your point across. This is not a creative writing class. You're just trying to describe what you've learned about the topic. We've already talked about do not cut and paste anything. We'll talk about quotes here in a minute. You want to use your quotes sparingly so that they have more effect. You want to use quotes that really nail the point home, for example. And then finally, proofread it again, proofread it out loud, proofread it to your dog. Just proofread it, because that's going to help catch those clumsy sentences and make it a little bit more clear and a little bit more readable. As far as the quality of the information, again, you're providing the reader with useful, interesting, unbiased information that describes what you've learned from credible sources. That's the whole point of this paper assignment. Read a lot from credible sources and then tell me what you've learned. You want to dig a little bit deeper into this type of assignment. Don't just keep repeating the same old thing with different data, saying, yeah, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. Okay, we know it's a problem because that's why you're selecting that topic. So what you want to do is dig deeper. Why is it a problem? What's going on? What for? How come? What are some of the decisions that have been made? What are some of the events that describe why it's a problem? What are human behaviors that contribute to this problem? You're looking for things like social costs, benefits, or even unanticipated consequences from these behaviors or from policies that are passed that people then work around, and it creates yet still more social costs. You want to use information and be descriptive in telling me what you've learned, so you want to dig a little bit deeper. So you just don't talk about things with generic definitions and broad assumptions. You want to be interesting, be descriptive, provide details and explanations, examples that helps explain what's going on. If you're talking about a particular issue, throwing a couple really vivid examples out there helps the reader understand what's going on. Rather than just generically say that, oh, a lot of people think this or that, well, use a survey instead. There's lots of polls and survey data out there. That way you can add a sentence that says, oh, 73% of people actually believe this. That is a lot more credible than just saying something off the top of your head that, oh, yeah, most people think this. Well, that's called hearsay, and that's really not going to provide anything useful to your paper. So avoid those broad generalizations that need substantiation or that cannot even be proven. Now, as far as citing goes, at the end of each passage where you have talked about a particular source that you're describing, the only thing that I need within the text is at the end of that passage, typically at the end of that paragraph is the most common, convenient place. You just want to put a very short little parenthetical note there, in this case, Jones 2014. So what I'll do when I'm reading your paper, I'll quickly jump to the back page and I'll look in alphabetical order. There's Jones. Aha, that looks like a pretty interesting source. It's obviously a credible source, looks good, and then I go back to reading. But that tells me that particular passage, whether it's 3 sentences long or paragraph long, whatever it is you're paraphrasing from that particular article, when you wrap that up, at the end of that passage, you will just provide a simple in-text parenthetical quote that's all I need. Then I can go to the last page and look at the full citation, which we've already looked at on that sample bibliography. Again, stay unbiased. Don't spout your opinions. That's not what the paper assignment is about. Anybody can do that. You don't need a college degree to go out and just tell everybody what you think. What we're trying to do is figure out how to learn and understand things. That's what we're trying to do with this assignment. Critical analysis, we've already talked about what that means. Be an analyst. Don't necessarily need you to be an activist yet. That's great. If you want to go out there and change the world, I highly recommend it. Go out there and make the world a better place. But for now, what we're trying to do is learn about the world and why human beings do the things they do. So for your paper assignment here, I want you to be an analyst, not an activist. Don't want to get off on these opinions or editorializing about what we should do or what we haven't done or this or that. We want to analyze what's actually been done, what has not worked, what has worked, what the problems are, why they're a problem. So that's what we're trying to do now, is just learn about the issue and understand how and why things are the way they are. As for your cited sources, there's a certain type. I've already talked about some good data sites that you can go. But as far as sources to avoid the blogs where people can just set up their own website and tell you what they think. They may be a smart person, but it's either hearsay or they're getting their information from somewhere else. So go directly to the credible information. Don't need dictionaries or encyclopedia websites or general information forums, because all the information that you're going to need to talk about your topic is going to be in those peer-reviewed journals, because they have to give you that background in those peer-reviewed studies, just like you're going to have to give me some background. So you don't have to go to and quote from dictionaries or encyclopedias. Stick with the credible peer-reviewed sources for the most part. Wikipedia is not necessarily a bad place to start looking, but Wikipedia is not the source. Wikipedia is just a forum where people can provide information, and Wikipedia does do a pretty good job of policing it. It might take them a while to catch something, but generally the sources of where that information is coming from is most often shown on Wikipedia, so you can actually go to that source and then see if that's a credible source. Again, you can't go wrong if you just stick with the library databases and stick with peer-reviewed academic journals. You know, nothing's perfect, but at least that is going to give you a good, sound, credible place to focus on. Google Scholar has also been working very hard to get a lot of the peer-reviewed sources available so that you don't have to go through the library databases. However, it's not complete. I would start with the library databases. If there is an article in the library database that sounds interesting, but yet they do not have the full text, then you might want to try Google Scholar, and they may have that posted as a full text somewhere through Google Scholar. So Google Scholar is a good companion piece to look for credible sources. Now, as far as quotes go, we already talked about this. You don't want to just paper your work there with a lot of big, huge quotes. That's That's actually lazy writing when you take a big, huge quote and chunk that down on your paper and you fill up a half a page and go, oh, great, half a page gone. Nope, that's not going to be good writing. You want to use the quotes sparingly. Find a quote that kind of sums things up at the end of a passage. And the only difference there at the end of a quote, which needs to be right at the end of that quote, regardless of where that quote is in your particular passage, generally I would recommend that put your quotes at the end of the passage as a way of really nailing that issue home with a really good quote that is from a very reliable or well-respected source. And then you can wrap that passage up with a good, effective quote. The only thing different I would need with the quotes is that you would just add the page number from that source that quote came from. So as before, you would put Jones 2014, but you would just add the page from that source where that quote came from. That's the only difference there. But I do need that at the end of a quote so that we can confirm that did come from a source, then that's going to be a reliable source as well. So you don't want to use too many quotes. That starts to get a little bit obvious when you start putting too many quotes in there, particularly when you put quotes in there that really aren't saying anything. Find a quote that's actually giving a conclusion or providing some useful information. Don't use a quote just because it's got some generic jargon in it. That starts to get fairly obvious that people are just using quotes to show that they have read the article, but if that quote's really not providing any useful information, I wouldn't bother putting it in there. Okay, so that wraps up the video on finalizing your paper. You can shoot me an email if you have any questions on it. Keep in mind that the forum for attaching your paper will be set up on the day it's due in Moodle, and you'll attach your paper to that forum in a Word file.